My name is Alivia Tison, and welcome to my action research presentation titled, "Do I have to do this in Spanish? Increasing willingness to communicate for special education and general education students in immersion schools." What led me to choose this topic was, as a special education teacher in the immersion classroom, I teach students with IEPs, which stands for Individual Education Program. If you have an IEP, it means that you are in a special education setting, but that you also go to general education classes with your peers. The problem I was seeing is that their general education teachers would sometimes come up to me and say, "So-and-so is not using Spanish," or "So-and-so is refusing to use Spanish in our classroom." And sometimes this has resulted in that student not being asked to be in that classroom for a while if they're not using Spanish. Now, this is compounded with the fact that some of my students' disabilities are in autism, learning disabilities, ADHD, which already results them in taking breaks in our resource room, we call it special education room, and being outside of the general education Spanish immersion room more than their other peers. Over time, I was finding that this would result in some of my students with IEPs leaving the Spanish immersion school for an English school. Sometimes this happened for students at my Spanish immersion schools who didn't have IEPs too, that just struggle with using the L2 in their general education classrooms. So this led me to this question: can we increase students' motivation to use the L2 so that they can stay in the least restrictive environment? And that is a special education word, least restrictive environment, which means giving all students access to the same education as their general education peers, which in this case would be the Spanish immersion school. So, my research questions are as follows. Number one, what impact does a Spanish club that includes language teaching tasks and explicit teaching of communication strategies have on elementary students with and without IEPs willingness to communicate in the immersion classroom? And number two, what impact does a Spanish club with language teaching tasks and explicit teaching of communication strategies have on elementary students with and without IEPs motivation towards the L2? I chose these two questions because I wanted to see if a Spanish club that included pairs of students in smaller groups would allow the students who are struggling to use the L2 to have a better opportunity in a smaller group to use Spanish. I also wanted to see if language teaching tasks and using, which I'll get into more later, but which allow students to create real life tasks that make for better, leaving a positive impact on their school community, would result in them using Spanish more in their general education classroom. And thirdly, I wanted to see if using a communication strategies, which are strategies that we use when we're stuck in a language, and it's basically a tool that we all use when we don't know what to say. If teaching those to students would actually help them have something else in their toolkit to use when they're feeling stuck in the general education classroom using the L2. So this brings me to the importance of this study. So as a special education teacher, I hope this study provides strategies for myself and other special education teachers in the immersion setting to keep their students in the least restrictive environment. I also hope that this study can provide more awareness of language teaching tasks and communication strategies for all elementary education, general education teachers. And thirdly, I hope that this can contribute to current second language acquisition research on the connection between motivation and L2 use for elementary learners. This brings me to the main components that inform this study. So for this literature review, which is just going to be an overview of all the research I used to inform my study, I started with special education in the L2 classroom. I also used literature regarding personal and situational influences on willingness to communicate. And then I thirdly used information on communication strategies. So let's dive right in. So first I looked at special education in language in second language classrooms. And to be honest, there's actually a lack of research about how special education students are doing in the foreign language classrooms. So I just needed to highlight that. But we'll see here that Sparks in 2016 found that there is not a foreign language learning disability. White in 2015 found that students at the university and secondary level are able to choose to be exempt from foreign language classes at times if they have a learning disability. And oftentimes White found that that is because a lot of the foreign language classes aren't giving students the accommodations and things that they need. Thirdly, we'll see here from Pecker and Regala in 2021 that data they collected over 2 years from 60 pre-kindergarten participants, 37 with IEPs at a French immersion school, ranging from found that students can experience success in the L1 while also having success in the L2. Lastly, I found Nick Andrayu in 2021 found that parents switch students from immersion schools at times due to anxiety that parents had about the difficulty that their own child was having in the L2. Sometimes it was recommended to them by educational psychologists or professionals in the school that their student transfer to a different school. And thirdly, sometimes parents transferred them from that immersion school to their native language school because they noticed that, in this case, their first language was English, because they noticed that they actually received more support in that English school than they were getting at their immersion school. Now let's dive into willingness to communicate. McIntyre in 1998 on page 548 found that the purpose of L2 education is to create willingness to communicate. He further, with his team, made this model of variables that influence willingness to communicate. At the top, you'll see L2 use, and below it, you'll see all the factors that influence a student's L2 use. These include things like motivation, confidence, age, and other factors. I'll now get into some of those other factors in empirical studies. Dawali and their team in 2018 found a significant difference in that there was more FLCA, or anxiety, on low intermediate learners than on high intermediate and advanced learners. This study actually corresponds with a lot of the literature I found showing that students who are lower in their in that second language ability or younger struggle more to produce the L2. Next, I'll get into the situational influences, and we'll see here that Shen and Byfield in 2018 found that it's important to give students more opportunities to communicate in small groups and for teachers to closely monitor who works well together in those small groups. Cow and Phillip in 2006 found that a student's willingness to communicate significantly increased in partner work and group work as compared to a whole group context. Now, I'm going to jump in here and switch to motivation. Before I get to tasks, I do want to highlight here that Salapur and Ruani in 2020 found that it's important to take into consideration both extrinsic and intrinsic motivation in the language learning class. Now I want to get into motivation through tasks, which shout out to Dr. Julio Torres, who is my professor at Southern Oregon University, who introduced me to this topic. Thank you so much, Dr. Julio Torres, for helping inform this study. Muir and Dornier in 2013 found that language teaching tasks are tasks where students create something that is important to them, which can improve students' DMC or direct motivational current. Now we will get into communication strategies, which is the last component of this literature review. So, Dornier in 1995 defined communication strategies as the techniques a speaker uses to communicate when presented with difficulties. Magarsar and Abdulzai in 2014 found in their study a significant increase in willingness to communicate for students who received instruction in communication strategies. So, now I'm going to get into the context that I'm in. So I'm a special education teacher in a suburb outside of Minneapolis called St. Louis Park. My school is called Park Spanish Immersion, and it's an elementary school. So you'll see here that my number of participants is actually 4 participants, which is lower than what I had wanted, but due to the pandemic, I had to reschedule some things, which I'll get into more in my limitations section. 2 of my participants in this study are with IEPs, which means that they're a part of our special education program, and they each chose 2 other students from their same 5th grade classroom to be a part of the study with them. There are 2 clubs, and 3 students were white. 1 student is a student of color, which is reflective of St. Louis Park demographics as a whole. They're all learning Spanish as their L2. 2 boys were in one group, 2 girls were in the other group, and they met for Spanish club in these groups of 2. So what did this club look like? So what this club looked like is a 30 to 45 minute club where students were either meeting with me during their lunch period or after school. Students chose which teacher made tasks they wanted to work on during this club, which I'll show you in just a minute. At the beginning of each club session, I presented them with a communication strategy, and I also provided them with an incentive reward system for using Spanish in our club. Here are the 6 tasks that students got to choose from. My students chose one group, the 2 girls in the club chose La Misión 6, which was an activity that they made. They made a video that for prospective parents of our immersion school, and they talked about why those parents should choose to send their students to our immersion school. And then the club with the 2 boys chose to do an activity for our gym teacher, and they created a video in Spanish with physical education activities and uploaded it to Seesaw for students who are in quarantine. These were the communication strategies I utilized at the beginning of each club. Week 1, I used confirmation clarifying, and I went over using como se dice and que significa. Week 2, I used resourcing, which meant students would look from their worksheet or paper and pull words from their paper if they got stuck and weren't sure what to say in Spanish. And week 3, I used circumlocution, which is a strategy of if you don't know the word, using words to describe that word. And then the last week, we reviewed all of these. Now this was the fun part, our incentive system. So basically after each club, students, the groups would either get a check or not, which they always got a check, but for using Spanish. Or if they used English, if I gave them a prompt, if they switched back to Spanish. If they got a check, that meant that at the last 5 minutes of our club meeting, they got to do a preferred activity that was like a basketball outside or playing a board game together. And then at the end of our whole intervention, by the end of the 4 weeks, if they got a check each time, they got to choose to have donuts or ice cream or cookies as a celebration. So here's the timeline. So you can see here for 2 weeks prior to the intervention, I had a control period where the Spanish club had not yet started. During that control period, I had a weekly observation data form with the teacher, and right after the control period, I conducted the pre-Likert survey and the pre-email interview with parents. I should mention that before any of this, I collected consent and assent forms from students and families. During the intervention here, the Spanish club, I continued to collect weekly observation data from teachers, and I also did something called field notes, which was writing down any comments I heard teachers or students make about the use of L2 or motivation towards the L2 in our club or outside of our club too. At the end of the intervention, I gave students the same Likert survey, and I conducted the same email interview with parents. Let's take a look at what that looked like. Here you'll see the observation data form. There were 2 questions. Number 1, ask the teacher on a scale of 1 to 10, being never use Spanish in class, 10 being always use Spanish in class. How often did this student use Spanish in your classroom this week? And then the second question was, compared to the rest of your class, did this student use Spanish the less, the same as, or more than the rest of their peers this week? And this became, less would be a 1, same would be a 2, and more would have been a 3 when I go into the data entry. Right here, you'll see the Likert survey. Shout out to Lisa Pescar of 2020, who just graduated last year from SOU SLI, who helped me make this Likert survey. And it was first adapted from Al Khalil in 2011 and measured 0.68 and 0.86 Cronbach's alphas. This was a 15-item Likert survey that measured students' motivation toward the L2. I'll get into this in the limitation section, but I found that 15 questions was a bit long for my students. Students ended up selecting an emoji face for their response to these questions. So absolutely true would be a 6 out of 6, and then not true at all would have been a 1 out of 6. Here you'll see the parent email interview. It asks for the student's name. Does your student like going to school most days? Yes would have been a 3 out of 3. Sometimes would have been a 2 out of 3, and 1 would have been and not liking to go to school most days would be a 1 out of 3. Similar for question 3 is if your student is open to using Spanish at home. Question 4, would you say your student likes speaking in Spanish? And number 5, what have you heard your students say about speaking Spanish? So those were all the data that I used to help me analyze the results of the study. What I did for the weekly observation data form from teachers is I inputted each participant's weekly score for L2 use and their weekly score relative to the rest of their peers into Microsoft Excel. I calculated each participant's control period average score for L2 use plus their score relative to the rest of their class. And then I ran paired t-tests between the control period average and their post-intervention score for L2 use and relative to class. For the Likert survey, I inputted each Likert item number and the participant score next to it for pre and post test. I found the median and mode score for each Likert item. I found the ranges between the median and mode from pre to post Likert survey, and then I ran the paired t-test between their pre-median and post-median scores. Now, for the email interview with parents, I inputted parents' answers into cells for each participant from pre-interview to post-interview. I found the mean score of the motivational question from pre to post-interview, and I displayed results in charts and used open-ended answers for qualitative data. Finally, for field notes, I had my entries and I analyzed using inductive coding. I then sorted by themes to reveal any commonalities and relevant findings. So let's get into those results now. Here you'll see this was the observation data form from their teacher, L2 use in class out of 10. Over here you'll see participants 1, 2, 3, and 4. If a star is next to that student's name, it indicates that the student has an IEP and is a special education student. This is participants 2 and 3. So participant 1 in the control period scored a 7.5 out of 10 for use of Spanish and their post score was an 8. Participant 2's pre-score was 2, post score of 4. Participant 3's pre-score was 8.5, post score of 8. And participant 4's pre-score was 8 and a post score of 9. This data was not statistically significant with a p-value of 0.35160. Now we'll get into what did that data look like relative to the rest of their class. And remember, this is out of 3. Participant 1 scored a 2.5 out of 3 on the pre relative to rest of class, and a post 3 out of 3 for speaking more than the rest of the class. Participant 1 scored participant 2 scored a 1 on the pre relative to rest of class and a post 1. Participant 3 scored a 3 for pre and a 3 for post. Participant 4 scored a 3 for pre and a 3 for post. The data was not statistically significant with a p-value of 0.43095. You'll see here that their L2 use was high before some of their L2 use was high before the intervention, which we'll get into more later. For the Likert survey, we'll see here that these are the median of Likert scale results. Remember, 6 was that really big happy emoji face of absolutely true, and 1 was that sad emoji face of not true at all. So participant 1 scored 6 out of 6 for pre and 6 for post. Participant 2 scored 4 for pre and 5 for post. Participant 3 scored 6 for pre and 6 for post, and participant 4 scored 5 for pre and 5 for post. Was this statistically significant? We can see that a lot of them were highly motivated before the intervention. No, the p-value was 0.43566667, which showed that the results were not statistically significant. Right here is what the graph looked like for L2 use on a scale of 1 to 10 in the general education immersion classroom. Participant 1, here you'll see control period mean, midpoint intervention, and it was red, and post-intervention is yellow. What I want to highlight here is that participant 2 for that midpoint intervention went from a 2 out of 10 for L2 use in his general education classroom to a 5 out of 10 L2 use mid-intervention, back to a 4 for post-intervention. Similarly to rest of class, you can see not much change between participants 1, 3, and 4, but participant 2 went from a 1 using less than the rest of his class to using the same as the rest of his class mid-intervention to back to a 1 less than the rest of his class by the end. Now, to triangulate the data here for the parent and email interview, this says, is your student open to using Spanish at home? Not much change here. Participant 1 really likes using Spanish at home, and there was not much to correlate this data with the data that was going on in their classrooms. Here's a Likert survey on motivation. Here you'll see numbers 1 through 8, okay? And remember, it's out of 15. So what I want to highlight here is that these are the pre-Likert survey medium, pre-Likert survey mode, post-Likert survey medium, post-Likert survey mode, and this is the range of the median and the range of the mode. As we'll see here, a lot of their median scores were already in 5 and 6, which showed high motivation. I want to highlight number 3. I like to try to speak in Spanish in my classroom. Median was 6, absolutely true, pre and post intervention, as well as it was absolutely true for number 1. I like to speak in Spanish with my teacher for the post-Likert survey. Learning Spanish is really great. They scored absolutely true there at the post-intervention. Something I do want to highlight is that the communication strategies that I taught them are highlighted here in number 5. When I don't know how to say something in Spanish, I try to use a strategy to still say it in Spanish. Oops. What we'll see here is that students actually went down from their medium. They went down -0.5. That's not a significant difference, but it is just something that I noted, and maybe that means next time when I do this same club, I'll want to really be more explicit about what are strategies, what are communication strategies. Let's look at Likert items number 9 through 15. Here you'll see, again, very absolutely true for number 9. I find learning Spanish really interesting. Something that was one of the lower scorings is number 10. Learning Spanish is one of the most important things for me as I grow as a person. And another low scoring one, would you like to have more Spanish lessons? I want to triangulate this data here with the parent email interviews. All parents scored, does your student like going to school most days? Absolutely yes, pre to post. Would you say your student likes speaking in Spanish? Absolutely true from parents, pre to post. This was a very highly motivated group. Let's look at the journal entries in the field notes. Participant 2 said, I spoke in Spanish for not 30 minutes, but 40 minutes after the first Spanish club. Participant 4 said, I never speak in Spanish for this long. The teacher came up to me in the lunchroom one day and said, the club is working. Participant 2 is using the same amount of Spanish as his peers. In terms of motivation, participant 2, before the club even started, said, can we get donuts? Once we were in the club meeting, participant 2 asked, ¿Cuándo vamos a ganar el premio? In the first minutes of being in the club. Participant 2 was noticeably upset it was the last session. He asked, is this our last session? Why is this our last session? Can we meet again next week? How come it's over? So, discussion of findings quantitatively, a Spanish club that included language teaching tasks and communication strategies did not have a statistically significant impact of elementary students with and without IEPs, willingness to communicate, or their motivation towards the L2. That being said, quantitatively, participant 2 started at a 2 out of 10 average for L2 use during the control period and grew to a mid-level of L2 use by the end of the study. Participant 2's median Likert score also increased the most. This corresponds with research that as L2 use increases, so does a positive attitude towards the L2, and that was found in Diwali and team in 2018. Discussion of findings qualitatively. All participants, teachers, and parents expressed positivity after the Spanish club. Participant 2 even saying, how come it's over? Qualitatively, all students spoke Spanish for the entire club. One group won the cookies they wanted, and the other group won like really special donuts, which corresponds with research about how working in partners can produce more L2 use and then the whole general education classroom. And that's found in Cal and Phillip in 2006. Here's the task that they did. This was the movie that one group created called Porque PSI, and this was the seesaw they created about the gym activity. Okay. My limitations for this study is that it was a very small sample size, a sample size of 4. COVID-19 pandemic prevented scheduling the Spanish club times for the rest of my students with IEPs because it had to be outside of their general education classrooms. The Likert survey, like I said earlier, was a little too long, I found, to get really accurate responses. In this study, there was a high level of L2 use and motivation prior to the study, which I'm not sure is reflective of all my students with IEPs, but it was reflective of the students in the study. And measuring the use of communication strategies in the future, I would really like to be more explicit even about what are communication strategies and maybe find a way to work those into their general education classroom too. So they're hearing the same language in our club and in their general education classroom. Recommendations. Special education and general education teachers, I think, continue to provide this intervention club earlier and throughout the school year. I also recommend monthly observation data between general education and special education teachers to see L2 use relative to the rest of their peers. And I recommend continue to providing authentic tasks to students in a Spanish club where they can choose a peer and can make a positive impact on their school community. Thank you so much for coming and listening to my research in my action research presentation. Thank you SOU SLI for making this possible. What questions and comments do you have? Thank you.